أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا أبو القاسم محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المنتجبين أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Thank you for joining us for this third session of the reflections on Ramzan Du'as. As we have been relating, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَإِذَا سَلَكَ عِبَادِي أَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ أُجِيبُ الدَّعْوَةِ الدَّاعِي إِذَا دَعَانِ. And when my servants ask you concerning me, then surely I am very near. I answer the prayer of the supplicants when he calls upon me. In the past sessions, we've looked at the three verses of this dua. Allahumma adkhil ala ahli al-kubur surur. Ya Allah, instill happiness in the spirits of the inhabitants of the grave. Allahumma agni kulla fakir. Ya Allah, enrich every indigent or poor one. And lastly, we looked at Allahumma ashbi kulla jai. That Ya Allah, satisfy every hungry person. Today, we look at the fourth verse in this dua, which says, Allahumma ksa kulla uryan. That Ya Allah, clothe every unclothed one. In the last session, we ended on a high note. The true joy lies in the act of giving without an expectation of receiving something in return. And the best form of prayer is not that of a slave out of fear or a trader out of reward, but of the free purely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Indeed, the mystic Rabia said in her poetry, Ya Allah, O my Lord, if I worship you from fear of hell, burn me in hell. If I worship you from the hope of paradise, bar me from its gates. But if I worship you for yourself alone, then grant me then the beauty of your face. Indeed, the true essence of benefiting from adding the right deeds to our supplications is that it allows us to immerse ourselves in the love of God, purely qurbatan ilallah, to seek His nearness. The Quran, as well as the Ahlul Bayt, teach us that the aim behind human creation is to attain Allah's proximity and nearness, and the path that leads one to realize this aspiration, which is none other than ibadah. In chapter 51, verse 56, Allah says, وَمَا خَلَقْتَ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسِ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. And I have not created the jinn and men except that they should worship me. Sometimes we lose this sight of the purpose of creation. What then is the purpose of creation? A question that has vexed many. The answer lies in chapter 15, verse 99 of the Holy Quran, which says, وَعَبُدْ رَبَّكَ حَتَّى يَأْتِيَكَ الْيَقِينَ. And worship your Lord until conviction comes to you. So He created us to worship Him so that we can attain conviction, meaning we can attain yaqeen. There are three levels of yaqeen, and we come to know from the tafsir of Suratul Takasur as well as Suratul Waqia. The first level is ilmul yaqeen, yaqeen that's based on knowledge. The second is ainal yaqeen, yaqeen that is based on seeing. And the third one is haqqal yaqeen, that yaqeen that is actually based on feeling. For example, seeing smoke signifies fire, even if we can't see the fire. This is ilmul yaqeen. We know that smoke signifies fire through our knowledge. Now we know something is burning when we actually see the fire. It is called ainal yaqeen. And we will be convinced that there is fire when we feel it's burning or warm, or when we put our hand into it. This is called haqqal yaqeen. So haqqal yaqeen is to attain the true marifah of Allah, or marifatullah as the scholars term. And the closer one gets to Allah, the better one's knowledge of one's creator becomes. In that vein, this is beautifully expressed by Imam Ali alayhi salam, that the dua is the ultimate goal of the human being. And for that marifah, when he says, Ya ghayat al-amal al-arifin, or the ultimate hope of the Gnostics. And this is the hope for each one of us to try and attain that highest level of yaqeen so that we attain marifatullah. So, worship raises us so high that we may witness God in our heart. Of course, each one of us has our own limitations, as explained by the tradition of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. Someone asked Imam alayhi salam, have you seen your Lord that you worship him? And Imam says, woe be unto you. I do not worship the Lord who I have not seen. The person asks further, how have you seen him? And Imam says, the human eye cannot see Allah. Rather, his heart can perceive Allah by real belief. At the same time, we must recognize that we reside in the physical world, a world of matter, and have to submit to natural laws which necessitates the meaning of life, such as food, drink, clothing, place of shelter, etc., which are our worldly needs. The verses in this dua acknowledges those needs, as we have stated in the past two sessions, that while uttering these words, like Allahumma agni kulla fakir, Ya Allahumma ashfi kulla jai, we try to actualize these words with positive actions. We must remember that these are meant not to be the goal. These are provisions for the journey of life, not the destination. Human innovation and advancement in science and technology. Just look at the means to the end, and we tend to mistake these as the yardstick of human progress. The question to ask is, does this innovation really serve to be the means on the path towards Allah or not? The internet, for example, is a means of communication, but is also a double-edged sword and can hamper us from being or can hamper us from traversing the path of eternal happiness. So we must distinguish the difference between the goal and the means. Focusing on the abundance of means, we tend to lose sight of the goal. Lives have become so busy in securing the means that we tend to forget the goal. So let's take a moment to reflect on this perplexing problem of the modern world, especially what we call the developed nations. Allow me to paint a picture and a scenario of where we are at. We have taller buildings, but we have shorter tempers. We have wider freeways, but narrower viewpoints. We have bigger houses and smaller families. We have more gadgets, but less time. We have more degrees, but less sense. We have more data, but less judgment. We have more medicine, but less wellness. We have multiplied our possessions, but reduced our values. We love too seldom and hate too often. We have added years to life, but not life to years. We have been all the way to the moon and back, but have trouble crossing the street to meet a new neighbor. We have conquered outer space, but not inner space. We have cleaned up the air, but polluted the soul. We have conquered the atom, but not our prejudice. We have more computers to hold more information, but we communicate even less and less. These are times of fast food and slow digestion. Indeed, these are days of disposable diapers as well as throwaway morality. This is the conundrum that we have. So, in that, the Quran reminds us that we would understand this reality when entering our grave. He says in the Holy Quran, Alhaakumut takasur hatta zurtumul makabir. Competing for abundance has engaged you until you come to your graves. So today, the verse under discussion is Allahumma ksukulla uryan, Ya Allah, clothe every unclothed one. In the light of what we have just discussed in the preamble, let us reflect on the term clothing, because of course clothing is one of the very basic necessities of human life, and indeed a blessing of Allah to the human being. when entreating the all merciful Lord to clothe all the naked. This verse gives us an opportunity to think of the purpose behind clothing and how clothing is only a means to an end. And this is what we need to understand. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Ya Bani Adama, kad anzalna alaykum libasay yuwari sawatika warisha walibasatu taqwa zalika al-khair. O children of Adam, surely we have sent you down clothing that covers your shame and an attire that causes beauty. And the attire of beauty is better. By referring to an important aspect of Adam and Eve's story, this verse draws on the attention of the people of Arabia at the time that they had begun to see dress or attire merely as a shield of protection against the inclemencies of the weather and as a means of adornment. The basic purpose of dress or attire to cover one's private parts of the body had receded into the background. Indeed, people had no inhibition about the immodest exposure of the private parts of their body in public. To crown it all, in the course of pilgrimage, they used to circumambulate around the Kaaba in stark nakedness. Immodesty, however, was not an exclusive characteristic of the people of Arabia. We know from many cultures that many nations indulge in it in the past, and many nations continue to indulge in it even now. So, this is what was directed to all mankind, which is the progeny of Adam. Therefore, the need of clothing has not been artificially created in man, but is inherent in human nature. Perhaps that is why Allah has not created a natural covering for the human body as He has done in the case of all other animals. Instead, He has instilled innately the feeling of modesty and shyness in the human nature. Allah has inspired man with the urge to hide the private parts of the body. Therefore, man should understand the nature of this inspired urge and make clothing for himself from the material provided by him. We have indeed sent down to you clothing, the ayah said as we recounted, that cover your shame and for adornment. The usage of clothing that He has sent for us is not just for covering the body and concealing our private parts, but it is also a factor for adornment. Clothing is a splendor and an ornament which makes one's stature seem more beautiful. Following this phrase, which refers to the outward clothing of people, the Quran now stretches a discussion to the spiritual clothing. As a manner of the Quran is in many instances, it combines these two aspects together and says that the clothing of piety is better than material clothing. وَلِبَاسُ التَّقْوَى ذَلِكَ الْخَيْرُ. And the attire of piety, that is the best. The resemblance of piety and righteousness to attire is very, very explicit. Clothing both protects the body from the cold and heat and is a fender against a great deal of dangers. It both covers the vices of the body and is an ornament for persons. Similarly, the essence of piety and righteousness, besides covering the ugliness of man's sins and protecting him from a lot of personal and social dangers, is also considered a great endowment for him. It is a notable ornament which increases his personality. So, as far as the history of mankind indicates, human beings have always worn clothes. But in our time, the secondary aspects of clothes, even its unpleasant instances, have so vastly spread that they are deterring us from the very philosophy of clothing as it had by the people before us. Today, clothing has taken a factor of kinds of luxuries, lust and gaudiness, haughtiness, extravagance, pride, and the likes of them. The custom of following fashion in clothing not only wastes a great deal of wealth, but also squanders a great part of our time and the powers of individuals. Here I am reminded of the oft quoted story of an emperor who had no clothes. Many of you have heard it. The emperor was cruel and unjust to his people, and the tailor in town decided to play a trick on him. He went to the king and offered to make for him the finest clothes ever. But instead of making a suit made out of cloth for him, he just pretended to make the suit and fooled the emperor into thinking that he was working hard by taking a long time. Eventually, after a period of waiting, he gives the emperor a handful of air and tells him that this is the best cloth that ever made. In fact, the tailor told him that the clothes are so fine to the point that the wearer doesn't even feel that he's wearing them. Blinded by his arrogance and not wanting to appear dumb in the eyes of the tailor, the emperor was happy with his new suit and ordered a public parade to take place so that he could show off his new clothes. Of course, everyone was too scared to tell this tyrant that he was actually naked. Instead, they saluted and flattered him, all except for one boy. He was too young to know the social convention or be afraid of tyranny, and pointed out the truth and said what others could not dare to express. Amazingly, this act, at least for that moment, made the fear change its place. Fear so overwhelmed the emperor that he became astonished and dumbfounded. People lost their fear of the emperor and laughed as they had never laughed before. So, while this emperor seemed to have been blinded by his own arrogance, the reality showed us that he was in fact blinded by his own fears and his people whose opinions he feared. Reality showed his ignorance not to be a sign of strength, but a sign of weakness. So, why do I share this story? Because it has a particular significance to the time that we live in. We live in a time where there are so many pressures to conform to the images of the media and the lifestyles of celebrities and so on and so forth. Some wear inappropriate and revealing clothes because not doing so would make oneself unfashionable. Maybe we find ourselves scared to make a change in society against the expectation of that society or even the world around us. All this comes from a type of fear of people rather than the fear of God. So it is the attire of piety which protects the soul of man. Clothing gives a human being an identity. It covers that which needs to be concealed, and it is a source of beauty and adornment. Humans have always used attractive clothes to make themselves look good and stand out at special occasions and show others their own individual taste, style, culture, identity. In this verse, when Allah says that the best clothing is that of taqwa, taqwa or God consciousness is both a protection and an adornment. It keeps you away from indecency and evil and beautifies you with the divine light that shines through it. So there can be no better decoration for the human being than that which decorates his inner self and manifests itself in his outer self through his words and action. And there lies between the cloth in the physical sense as well as our clothes in the spiritual sense. Indeed, Imam Musa Kazim al-Islam is reported to have said that whenever a person would like to put on a new dress, he should wipe his hand over it and say, "Praise belongs to Allah who clothed me with what I cover my shame and beautify myself amongst the people." So, having spoken about this great blessing, Almighty Allah transports us to a very important matter. He reminds a human being that he is not just composed of material body to need the material attire only. Rather, the inner attire is of fundamental significance. In the words of the Quran, ذَلِكَ الْخَيْرُ, that is better, the attire of piety. The key reflection on our part on this verse of the supplication is, am I amongst those who are spiritually clothed or otherwise? If not, then I should seek divine help to establish so that I am able to wear that attire of taqwa within myself. The other fundamental use of clothing is to look presentable and beautiful. The inclination to be beautiful is inherent in every human being, and there are ample indications in our holy traditions that encourage one to look beautiful and presentable within the limits of Sharia. Islam never advocated ugly attire, poor attire, nor, dare I say, the new fashionable scruffy look. The inspiring thought for me is that in the same manner as taqwa and piety is a source of protection from sin, as Shaykh Mutari puts it, that is an immunity from sin, it also is a source of inner beauty. This is because it embellishes the inner form of the human being with excellent character and makes him the beloved of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ya Allah, we humbly ask you to clothe both the physically as well as the spiritually naked ones and seek your support to help those who have no proper clothes in their physical lives and enable us to clothe our inner selves with the attire of taqwa so that we may acquire the worth to clothe others as well. Thank you for joining us today. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.